on for years. And the sad truth is that whenever a topic comes into the public's mind, it, in a sense, is old stuff. When you start catching on to something, even though the formality, the open formality of signing some agreement or whatever may yet still be to happen, the fact is the machinery for it all was set up years ago. The bureaucracies, the training was set up years ago. Even the generations growing up, the young ones were indoctrinated into the next phase of what is to be. That's why there's no communication between generations. Each one is scientifically updated for what they will experience in change form in their lifetime. And read the old communist speeches on this very technique, because Beria in the Soviet Union gave quite a few talks on this scientific indoctrination of children and the way that they could actually change them. At that time, back in the 20s and 30s, they could change the indoctrination for change every 5 years and update it. He said it used to take us a generation, 70-odd years, to get a change through in society. Now they can do it within 5 years of intense indoctrination. That's media bombardment, that's teaching at school, that's all those things combined. And novels and all the other things that reinforce all of these ideas. Now it's down to pretty well the year. Every kindergarten child going into school is getting taught a little bit more along the agenda than the guy who was in kindergarten last year. These are all preparations for changes for the society that they're going to grow up into. And they will accept them passively because they've been indoctrinated to accept them. We're not dealing with haphazard circumstance here. There's no bumbling fools at the top. And the public catch on, as I say, to what's going on. It's old stuff. Old stuff. A good example of the legalities they use to reinforce their system came when, or was announced by Bob Rae, who was the premier, that's like the governor of Ontario, some years ago. And at that time he played the part, and I mean it, he played the part of being left of Marx with the NDP party in Canada. And sure enough, when his term was over, he'd put us 4 or 5 times in debt of what we had before. And now he's recently re-emerged as a Liberal candidate for the leadership. Because they don't care about parties. These boys are playing the universal game here. It's a game, really. They know there's only one agenda. It doesn't matter what party you pretend to belong to. But Bob Rae had put so many laws into the books, and the whole team that worked with him put so many laws into the books. He said, it doesn't matter, he says, now that the NDP was leaving office to make way for the next party, he said it would take them years to unravel this, the legalities, to change any of it. And we have to wonder why. You'd think if you had bad laws, it's a simple matter of just taking out the appropriate laws, the files, and tossing them in the fire, where they belong. But we're dealing with a system that you and I are not allowed into. It's like a religion. It is a religion, in fact. They have their own version of things, and law, and they have their own meaning of law, again, is of uttermost importance to them. That's why in the U.S. Constitution they said that the people under law, they never explained what they meant by, they never defined law, you'll notice. And they were all Masons, of course. We live in a topsy-turvy world of Disney. It's a Disneyland. One reality for Joe Public, and another reality for those who get into the know. And even those guys don't know too much. They're told all they need to know for their position. They know, in fact, not to ask the wrong questions. One fellow in Canada asked me how he could check into any Masonic doctrine or control of Canada. And I'll answer him now. Look at the Parliament building. Just look at the architecture. That's all you have to start with. In fact, that would keep you going for a long, long time if you got into it. The language on one level, which is all around you, is symbolic. It's all symbols. You won't be taught this at school. In fact, you're taught not to think at school. You're taught to repeat, but not to think. Critical thinking is taboo. They probably put you on Prozac today. They don't teach logic in school anymore. They teach socialization processes to go along with the groupthink, which is just consensus led by a very well-indoctrinated leader. But start off with parliament buildings, in any country, by the way. You'll see the same architectural structure. You'll see the spires, which are just obelisks. Look at the tops of the windows, you'll see the arches. You count them. Everything is part of the Masonic language. It's all around you. Every place has got a Masonic lodge under one name or another. And yet it's quiet, isn't it? So quiet. They have all the outward sects all fighting each other. It's the Jesuits, no, it's the Billy Grahams and Protestants, and on it goes. And yet, amongst every group, here's these little quiet temples where every important member of every board, from the school board to the council board to whatever in your area, that's where they all go. That's where they go. That's where they meet. Yeah. And unless you join them, you won't get inside on their meeting nights. When they pull out all their jewels, as they call them, and put all the stuff on the floor, the little chessboard, the yin, the yang, the male, the female, the spirit, the earth. There's a completely different world all around you, shown in symbolism. And that is why a Mason from any country, without knowing another's language, verbal language, can go into any other country and get the exact same meanings from the architecture, the logos all around them, by counting the flutes on pillars in cathedrals, etc. You live in a world where you have been taught, not only taught to be blind, you have been blinded. Because a child left to his own devices without super indoctrination from the parents or the school would ask the right questions. And generally it starts with a simple word: why? Why is that? Etc. The shock of waking up is akin to the meaning that's always existed of being reborn, born again, because you have to reevaluate everything you've ever thought was true. In fact, you have to reevaluate all of the foundational beliefs that you had, which kept you standing, basically. The props are gone. You're kind of floating above the floor a little bit, but you're still in level 1 reality. And the first thing people will do is to grab all the information that's out there and try and download this into people's minds around them, and they sound crazy. And because they're frantic and it shows. They sound crazy about all the things that are happening, and they're telling this to people who are still watching the 6 o'clock news. You can't do that with people and expect to be believed. You have to go cautiously. So don't start to evangelize until you know far, far more than the stage that you're at. Because then comes a form of calmness to deal with this. This has been ongoing for thousands of years. You become calm, and you must remember that you can't hit people with 100 problems at once. The human mind is not meant to cope with that kind of problem. They can only deal with one thing at a time. And to ramble all over the map with the sky is falling will just ridicule yourself and ostracize yourself as being crazy. Accept the fact that, change is happening. There's been so many changes within your own lifetime that you didn't even notice. Most people alive today have floated through the whole period where the General Agreement on Trades and Tariff, the GATT Treaty, was signed, and it was in between the sports and the soaps and the police dramas and hospital dramas that we watch. And people floated through that. It was to do with world trade and who would get the trade, and a star chamber court that would decide penalties for nations that broke the rules, etc. And then, of course, we all paid through that GATT treaty. The taxpayers of the world paid to have their own factories moved to China. Only a short time ago, Canada and the US, and before that Britain as well, actually had factories. Yep, they made things themselves. So people have floated through that transfer of the tooling, the machinery, everything to China. Never mind the years of planning and negotiations of bureaucracies that had dealt with all of this stuff. It didn't just happen. They didn't shake hands and that was it. It took years and years and years of preparation to make that happen. But people have lived through this and seen the ending of made in the USA or made in Canada until it's made in China. Everything they buy is made in China, and yet those same people didn't think anything strange about it. Why would the capitalist nations, now supposedly capitalist nations, be funding the transfer of their wealth production to a communist nation, its supposed arch-enemy? And today, most people have never asked that simple question. Who would have thought, eh? Who would have thought, with the old story about communism versus capitalism, who would have thought that the communists would beat you by being better capitalists than you are? And that the reason is the capitalists and the communists were created by the same group, the dialectical process. And it is more efficient, certainly, in China with a totalitarian government to run a system and stand against all complaints. There's no complaints department in China. You don't complain in China. They're ruthless. And yet here is China, supposedly still communist China, holding the debt of the United States. They hold the massive debt that the United States owes. They buy all the big bonds. Before that, Japan used to play this game that Japan would hold the debt. It was going back and forth like a yo-yo. Then the US would own Japan's debt and back and forth, etc. Even though Japan, modern-day Japan, was set up during and before, in fact, World War II, it was planned and set up to become what it became by people within the United States. It was also propped up. I mean, they planned to make it the electronic leader of the world during World War II. And they went in and applied the plan. Hopkins was involved, and good buddy FDR. And they had it all laid out. They had a perfect society with its class distinctions that no one questioned, and everybody was obedient. A perfect obedient society who would work for peanuts and give them status because it was status they craved. And very obedient, very hard-working people. And sure enough, they became the leaders in electronics for a while. Nothing happens by chance. FDR himself said that if it happens in politics, it was planned that way. Even the scandals are planned. People generally tell you where they are in their headspace and in their understanding by the questions they ask you. And those who are still just hovering above the floor in level 1 will ask you the same questions. Is there a God? Because they're trying to drag their old paradigm, that which they were used to, into the new paradigm, because they want rules, laws, and regulations, which their old paradigm was full of, you see. That they want a reaffirmation. And I always tell them, I ask them, why do you ask me that? Because it doesn't matter what I believe. Belief can only be a personal thing if it's based on experience. And it's more important that the questioner answers that question for themselves. And the big scary thing is, well, what if there isn't? Or what if it's not the old guy in the sky, the big father figure, who's going to watch over me? And that's why you just can't wake up everybody. A lot of people will fall apart completely if you would enter the truth with them. Not everyone can break out of their conditioning. In a sense, it's all they know. It's the only reality they've ever known, even though it was fake. It's all they know. And if they haven't started waking up for themselves, and at least asked a few pertinent questions, then is it your job to wake them up? Or is it your fear of everything that makes you need to have people around you understanding and knowing what you know? Is that a group mentality breaking out in yourself? The world is going through massive changes, always has been. The culture has been turned upside down, not for the first time. Go back to Plato again, he talked about it 2,300 odd years ago. And most folk float through the changes as though it were quite normal. Even though there's chaos within their own lives and all around them, they still think it's normal, because they can't think for themselves. They only think what the media tells them to think, like Mr. Kissinger said. And he should certainly know. You can only get peace when you break through all of the old paradigm and don't fall for all the traps which are laid out for you to fall into, and always have been laid out for you to fall into when you're breaking free. Some people become hyper-neurotic because, you see, religion, on the one, apart from dominating your life and regulating it and making you obedient, religion was there to tell you, don't worry, they're there, it'll be all right in the end. And you'll, after this all terrible life, you'll live forever, and the bad guys will get punished. And that's the only thing that you can believe in, because everyone in every nation has seen the corrupt evildoers always benefiting in the system and their families. And so they gave you the hope or the reasoning that well, they get punished after death, you see. And you would take their word for it. That stopped you from doing anything about it in this life. You allowed the evil to flourish. Very clever technique. But once you take that away from someone, they're really floating then and grasping at everything. And because religion also told them, well, don't worry, you'll live forever in a new body or whatever, or spirit or yada yada, depends on which group you belong to. And a lot of people fall into a hyperneurosis. They become hypochondriacal, terrified of dying in this life. And they go out there and they fall immediately into the health traps, the health foods and all the pills that you can stuff your face full of, and exotic things from faraway countries that are supposed to cure everything under the sun. And then they fall into the New Age traps, which, and the New Age and the health food industry go together. It's all part and parcel of the same new religion, you see, designed by the same boys who ran every other system. But they fall into this I can't die thing. I just don't want to die. I must keep living. And so if this grass here is better for me than the porridge oats I've been buying, then if I've stuck my face full of this expensive grass from overseas or at the top of the Andes Mountains or somewhere, I'll live forever. And they become hypochondriacal and totally obsessed with health. And almost like religious fanatics with those around them who want to do the same as they do. And then they get into all the other New Age stuff that's out there, the feng shui, and energies are coming up, and oh my God, they're coming through the windows, and you deflect them all over the place, and all these, this bombardment by energies is going to finish them off unless they do all the right rituals, and they become bound, totally bound by a ritualistic thinking and behavior. Again, this is intentional. It was created from the top. Nothing would exist in this system. Nothing. Especially, nothing would definitely be promoted in this system unless it was authorized to be there. And yet, people will say, well, is there no hope? And I tell them, well, it depends how you view the outcome. And traditionally, in the West, because we've been taught groupthink all the time, and we've been taught nationhood and us against them, there's always a them somewhere. We've been taught that we all sort of go together in heavenly chariots, all together to the same place. And that's all nonsense. It's nonsense. Even in Christianity, I don't think the one they're founding it after ever said he came to save everybody. Broad was the way that led to damnation. Narrow was the way for the few to go. And there's a deeper truth there than people realize. And it's an eternal truth, you see. That wasn't the first time that had been written down. And in fact, most of the things in the New Testament were all said long before, over and over again, because there are eternal truths built in there as well. The journey that anyone is on is their own life experience, beginning to end. And it's not supposed to be a producer-consumer experience until you become what they now term, again, the dehumanizing term, geriatric. You know, it's like calling a baby a fetus. It dehumanizes it. And that's intentional, by the way. But life is supposed to be a process of attainment, not by the world standards, which is diplomas and degrees and applauds, but personal achievement. And I tell people about hope. I say, well, if you have truly broken through against the thousands of years of perfected indoctrinations on every generation, and an even more intense indoctrination, say in the last 100-odd years, through universal education, which the Masons proudly will tell you in their own writings they were the ones to push to get the same standardized indoctrination. If you've broken through all of that and your religious indoctrination to give you terror at the thought even of thinking for yourself, if you've broken through all the conditioning, you're so apt to miss a vital thing. That in itself is a miracle. You see, that's the first miracle. That's truly a miracle. And people who have been a little bit awake for some years are so apt to forget that. But they never stop and analyze why they broke through. Why them and not someone else? And it's because somewhere within the individual is the ability to analyze themselves. Every trait of evil and kindness that you see in the world is also held within yourself. There are people in this world who are incapable of looking at themselves critically. They can rationalize and justify anything they do to save their ego. Those are the ones, the leg boys for the New World Order. Many of the names that you already know. And they can, and although it'll sound absurd to the listeners, rationalize death, destruction, and slaughter, and depopulation. So someone who's broken through has the ability to see all of those critical things within themselves, possibilities. And that's what it was meant by the microcosm. Everything that has happened in the world and can happen, the potentials are all within yourself as an individual. So people who have broken through have also had the ability not only to recognize that there was something intensely wrong with everything around them, but they also have the ability to reflect upon themselves. Because how could you possibly scream about the New World Order and what's coming down the pike if you haven't thought out a process of how to steer everything in a different direction? They all want to change. Everyone wants to change, but it's just that they want a leader to do it all for them. That, again, is the groupthink mentality that the West has been totally indoctrinated with. They've never thought out the process of, we know where this is all heading, how should or could it be? And if they get to that stage, they'll still think in groupthink, like we, us, against them. And you'll find there's just as many of them, the Kissinger types, at the bottom levels of society, scattered through occupations, as there are at the top. Actually, there's more down at the bottom levels. The same traits are showing within them. And there's people that you probably know around you who have those traits. They work as petty officials, or they're in police or military or something to do with authority because they love authority. And I've been through that in previous talks, the authoritarian figure. The sadomasochism, the sadomasochist shows masochistic behavior towards a superior because he craves that power. He worships power, and when he gets it, he is the sadist. He's also the sadist to those beneath him, while he's groveling to those above him. The problem isn't just a small elite at the top manipulating all of this. Yes, they have the power. Yes, they have the agenda. Yes, they have the thousands of think tanks to deal with every possible outcome within society, but they completely depend upon the same personality types as themselves, existing all the way down all the strata, right down to the bottom levels as well. And so there's no clear definition of us or them. We're dealing with types of personalities here. How many people truly, in a week, reflect on the chaos in the world, or the starvation that's happening in different parts of the world, or the people getting slaughtered in the Middle East now for the agenda? So all you're really seeing is a reaction to individuals being touched by the evil that's all around them. It's almost like screaming if someone burns you. In fact, it's very much like that. Whereas, how many of them would be screaming at all if they were not being burned? It was just everyone else around the planet that was being burned, but they gave them a second thought. You see, we're tremendously, tremendously selfish. And people who are screaming out about the New World Order are just screaming because that which is familiar to them is being changed without them being considered or even participating in the decision making. The world has been a hell for a lot of people for an awful, awful long time. We love to think that we're all sane. But what would you call sanity? What is sanity? What is civilization? What is progress? Who defines these things for us? When you stand back and look at most eras down through history, and people look back with nostalgia, they make movies, nostalgic movies, about fictional 8 times. And the closest they get to reality is to show you an upper middle class and the little things that absorb them, little dramas they go through under the guise of fantasy or drama. And yet they never tell you the other side of the story, when the masses of people were suffering horribly in squalor and poverty. We don't want to look at that as too depressing. And that which we will not face will be repeated on every generation.